Water is life. Water is tranquility. It fills our oceans, rivers, and lakes. It's also in our games. Throughout the short history of the medium, creators have continued to refine and perfect the display and simulation of H2O. It's a difficult problem to solve, but one that has given birth to a multitude of unique and often beautiful solutions. On this episode of DF Retro then, we're doing something a little different, exploring the evolution of video game water, from the 8 and 16-bit days through the birth of 3D graphics and beyond. I've selected a number of games for this episode which represent key milestones and techniques in this refreshing corner of game graphics. So grab a cool drink, sit back, and enjoy the plunge into the world of virtual H2O. Fire up any recent game, and if it features water in any capacity, chances are good that it'll look suitably refreshing. While proper fluid simulation remains computationally expensive, the visual representation of water has continued to evolve and impress for years. It's fair to say that water looks great in most games released today. But if you dive back into the early days of gaming, water is one of those things that has always been difficult to get right. In early examples, entire stage themes were dedicated to the concept of swimming. Sometimes it worked, other times it was frustrating, but the water itself was typically simplistic in its appearance. Most games from this era rely on a combination of appropriate scenery tiles, a suitable color palette, such as blue, and modified controls used to simulate buoyancy. Now, something to keep in mind as we progress through the annals of virtual water is that there are basically three elements which make up the display of water in games. There's the visual element of the water surface, including the animation and reflection of light. There's the wave patterns, which can sometimes be interactive. And there's the rendering of underwater segments and the associated water caustics. Some games focus on just one element, while others attempt to simulate all aspects of the water at least as much as possible. Most retro games then typically focus on just one element. Case in point, the scanline trick in Vice Project Doom, a very late release for the NES. If you check out the background there, reflections, ripples, and indeed the entire parallax background effect are displayed using mid-frame register writes. Things were progressing to the point where things like lights reflecting into a body of water were being considered when drawing the artwork. Batman Return of the Joker for Nintendo Game Boy is another great example. The programmers utilize a pair of tricks to create an impressive water ripple effect. In this case, lines are manipulated in groups of two, allowing the developers to create a warping effect as if the water were passing in front of the scenery. This is combined with flickering, where the water is blanked out every other frame. This likely reduces the cost of the scanline manipulation, but also, thanks to the slow pixel response of the original Game Boy's LCD, it helps give the impression of transparency, since the screen can't update fast enough between frames. It all sort of blends together. Curiously, one of our upcoming examples can be traced back to the Game Boy as well. The original Wave Race is an overhead jet ski racing game, and it's not great. The frame rate is sluggish, and it exhibits screen tearing on real hardware, a lot like Castlevania the Adventure. That said, clever palette manipulation helps give the impression of a translucent water surface, and the name Wave Race would go on to become synonymous with water effects in games. 16-bit consoles then opened greater possibilities when it came to displaying H2O. Underwater, games such as Sonic the Hedgehog and many others for the Sega Genesis make use of their own mid-frame register writes, or raster effects, to change the color palette at a defined point. This enables bodies of water to display differently than the surface without requiring bespoke tiles. It saves on memory and it looks great. It's even possible to manipulate scanlines to create this underwater ripple effect as we see in Sonic CD. On the Super NES, the addition of color math, which is commonly referred to as transparency, allows developers to utilize bespoke foreground layers specifically for water. With the right values, you could create the illusion of a true transparent layer, and it looks great. In fact, the expanded color palette of the Super NES in general allows developers to create things like the water in Secret of Mana. Or Donkey Kong Country for that matter, which is renowned for its underwater stages. But really, it's just smart use of the hardware. The foreground makes use of a scanline effect to create the illusion of ripples, while line scrolling of the background plane allows for increased depth. But what really sells this stage is the choice of color palette. The rich, deep blues of the background just look remarkable even today. On the water surface side of things, however, developers such as Konami really push the boundaries in terms of neat visual effects. Take Sparkster on the Super NES. A tile and sprite mirroring trick of some sort is used to give the illusion of reflections in this opening stage. With the slight variation in color palette, it genuinely does appear as if it's reflecting the scenery around you. A similar effect is also evident in its prequel, Rocket Knight Adventures on the Sega Genesis, and in the second stage of Castlevania Bloodlines. Konami really seems to have loved this trick. Thunder Force 4, of course, also features a great line scrolling effect and this underwater warping technique when you submerge. I could go on and on, of course, but I think by now you get the point. By and large, water effects during this era were entirely artist-driven. Sure, player controls were usually modified to simulate swimming, but the water itself was not a simulated body. But all of this would begin to change as 3D graphics became more common. This is where we would begin to see new innovations in displaying water in video games. During the early days of 3D, processing power was severely limited, and most water surfaces in 3D games were treated as simple planar surfaces with artist-generated textures applied to their surface. The fixed function hardware of this era was fairly limited, true, but it rewarded creativity. Take the original Panzer Dragoon, released in early 1995 in Japan. It's one of the first examples that comes to mind when thinking about water during this era. The first stage roughly simulates the appearance of a large body of water with associated reflections. The Saturn's second video display processor manipulates this plane on a per-line basis to give the illusion of waves, while textures designed to appear warped are manually placed beneath the surface to simulate reflections. By 1996, 3D graphics were taking off on the PC in a big way. Duke Nukem 3D hit the PC in early '96, introducing fully explorable water volumes into the popular first-person shooter genre. While not truly 3D, it was now possible to designate sectors within the game world as water zones, while placing an animated water texture on the surface plane. This would be further expanded upon in Shadow Warrior a year later with support for proper transparency. The original Quake delivers a similar effect. In its initial software renderer, fluid textures are manipulated in code, creating a warbling effect that appears much smoother than the simple water surface in games like Doom or even Duke Nukem 3D. Like Duke, underwater exploration was also possible, but the player view was distorted to simulate the underwater experience. Both of these effects would change when OpenGL support was added in the form of GL Quake. I've always preferred the look of the software renderer in this regard, however. But there was another more impressive example released months earlier in 1996, Terra Nova Strike Force Centauri from Looking Glass Technologies. Using its advanced software renderer, Terra Nova is able to present not only massive environments with rolling hills stretching way off into the distance, but it can also simulate the reflectivity of water, complete with an associated warping technique. But here's the kicker. Terra Nova seems to use some sort of proto-screen space technique for its reflections. I'm not entirely certain how this works. Perhaps it's just image data stored in an off-screen reflection buffer which is then projected into the space, or maybe it's something else entirely, but either way, it behaves weirdly similarly to modern screen space reflections. When scenery is occluded from view, the reflections disappear as well. And there is visible garbage along the edge of the reflection on the left and right side of the screen. For its era, Terra Nova is one of the most advanced simulations of light and reflectivity across a water surface. No wonder this game maxes out at 320 by 400 resolution. The original Tomb Raider is another interesting example. While its water surface is a simple transparent texture, core design attempted to simulate actual water caustics by warping the vertices designated for underwater zones. The Saturn version even has the edge here, as you can see the geometry distort. It's crude, but it really does give the impression of water caustics. But as impressive as all of these games are, and there are others beyond this, you all know what I'm building towards. No game made waves in this space quite like Nintendo's Wave Race 64. Now, to understand its place in history, keep in mind that the Nintendo 64 itself was first released in 1995 in Japan. This is at a point when consumer 3D graphics cards on the PC were just beginning to appear and had yet to be fully embraced by the industry. Up until this point, 3D graphics in the home were typically handled entirely in software and run on the CPU. Sure, arcade games were more advanced at this point, but they weren't really affordable. Offloading 3D graphics to dedicated hardware is key to the upcoming graphical revolution that would follow, and Nintendo 64 offered many similar features in its own hardware. Games like Super Mario 64 hinted at what could be achieved, but it was Wave Race 64, released in 1996, that demonstrated a new approach to water rendering that would remain impressive for years to come. The idea is simple. The plane on which the player races is represented using a triangular mesh. Using various equations, the developers can dynamically undulate this polygonal mesh, which gives the impression of waves. The jet skis then are designed to collide with this surface, simulating buoyancy in the process. In motion, the effect is remarkably convincing. While it's true that Wave Race 64 runs at a not-so-blistering 20 frames per second, it was perhaps the first game of its kind to properly simulate the effect of waves in a 3D space while influencing player movement. There's a lot of harsh restrictions in place, sure, but it looks convincing. Case in point, the water mesh itself is constrained around the player character. If we bring in emulated footage in high resolution, this becomes clear as day. The water is only rendered out a few meters or so from the player at any point. If you look beyond this point in space, water is then represented using flat textures. When played in its native resolution on real N64 hardware, however, the 2 points blend naturally, giving the impression of a large body of water. If we bring up a wireframe representation of the game, we can learn even more. There are different types of waves presented across each course. A base sine wave-like ripple appears at regular intervals here. The point of origin, however, seems anchored to the camera frustum. Notice how the ripples follow the camera and originate from this set position in space. There's other wave patterns as well, such as this one here, which has a fixed position producing larger waves at set intervals. Basically, it seems that Nintendo has defined various rules and points across the surface from which waves are generated. Keep in mind that the jet skis themselves do not actually generate waves. Simple alpha textures are used to simulate water spray instead. Ultimately, Wave Race 64 was a huge leap forward in this regard. Tying gameplay mechanics to wave patterns works extremely well and helps create a very dynamic racing experience. But it's not the only Nintendo 64 game to attempt something like this, however. The puzzle game Wetrix, a falling block game, features an interactive water mesh that rises and falls based on your performance in the game. As you build structures and more water drips onto the playfield, you wind up with these lovely interactive ripples across the game area. Diddy Kong Racing is another example of a fixed wave system. Combining three-dimensional waves on which the player can race with artist-generated animated water textures enables this nice smooth water surface. The game also demonstrates the benefits of bilinear texture filtering in 3D games. Turok Dinosaur Hunter is another great example. While the water itself isn't interactive like Wetrix, the developers combined several elements to create some of the best looking water in a first-person shooter from this era. The water plane itself exhibits fixed wave patterns, while a very high-quality animated texture is applied to its surface, and underwater sequences look great as well. A similarly well-animated but even higher quality implementation showed up in Sega's Virtua Fighter 3, which was released back in 1996. Jeffrey's stage here on the beach features gorgeous water textures with water lapping up on the beach during the fight. Speaking of Sega, the Saturn was no slouch during this time either. While the system was no match for N64 in terms of replicating certain visual effects, it did have VDP2. The water trick used in Panzer Dragoon would appear in other games as well, including its 2 sequels. Panzer Dragoon Saga, the RPG, uses this to create convincing pools of water, even right here at the start of the game, while Panzer Dragoon 2 offers similar effects in certain stages as well. Then there's Grandia for the Sega Saturn, which renders large bodies of water using VDP2. Again, it's a simple flat plane, but the warping and rippling effect seen here is completely absent from the PlayStation port of the game, and it looks really good here on Saturn, I think. Some other games worth mentioning. Sonic R also takes advantage of VDP2 to create these lovely bodies of water complete with pseudo-reflections. Really though, Sonic R is kind of a technical powerhouse for the system. And while we're talking about Sonic, I think Sonic Jam's free roaming section is also worth mentioning. This is nice looking water, right? Well, yes and no. You see, there's not really any water there at all. It's just a texture trick. There's no surface plane to the water at all. With the selected camera angle and strategic use of splash textures, however, it does give the impression of a true transparent water surface, even when there really is none. Now, the PlayStation doesn't fare quite as well overall, but there are a few examples of great water on the system. Take this pseudo-open-world action game known as Terracon. Not only does the game render a large environment, but it offers a nice three-dimensional solution to waves on a PlayStation 1. And when you fall into the water, the splash textures appear surprisingly detailed, almost as if it's simulating bump mapping. Or how about this miracle port of Hydro Thunder? While the visuals certainly take a hit compared to the original, the results are still supremely impressive for the original PlayStation. But obviously, it's not as refined as the original version of the game, and Hydro Thunder itself is something we need to talk about. It was first released in arcades back in 1998, 2 years after Wave Race 64. This is a very different sort of game, however. Rather than focusing on wave simulation and wave physics, Hydro Thunder instead focuses on water surface texture and reflections. The portrayal of water looks great even if it's relatively simple. It's just a large flat plane with nice artwork applied to it. The original arcade game was powered by 3DFX Voodoo arcade hardware, by the way, but it was quickly ported around to other systems including Dreamcast, PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and more. The Dreamcast version launched alongside that system and served as a great launch game, but I'm almost more fascinated with the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation versions. The PS1 version that we've already seen looks really impressive, but how about N64? Again, the development team managed to capture the look and feel of Hydro Thunder almost perfectly. It runs at a lower resolution and frame rate, but it's still decidedly Hydro Thunder. It also shows up in a collection released for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and the GameCube known as Midway Arcade Treasures 3. At first glance, it's a nice port, but the alpha textures used to simulate the splashing of your boat across the water surface are hugely toned down across all 3 versions, making it almost seem as if you're simply clipping through the water plane. Either way, Hydro Thunder was a slick water-based racing game with great visuals, even if it failed to push new boundaries in terms of actual water simulation. 1998 also saw the release of the original Unreal on the PC. This was the first time the Unreal Engine was used in a shipping product, which makes sense since it was specifically crafted for this game, and its fluid system is one of its defining features. Ultimately, it's just a continuation of the flat plane approach seen in Quake, but with much higher quality animated surfaces. It's even possible to use the detail texture layer to add a second pass of water to increase the level of detail. Either way, for such a large-scale shooter, the water looks drop-dead gorgeous, especially for 1998, and it really elevates the experience. Anyone that played Unreal at the time will certainly remember this original waterfall. Or how about Jurassic Park Trespasser for the PC? This long-delayed game is extremely fascinating and something I'd like to examine in a future episode, but today I want to mention its water. The developers managed to craft a simple but effective method for displaying ripples as you move through various water volumes. Now, this doesn't apply to the ocean areas surrounding the whole island, that's a simple texture, but small pools of water like this appear fully interactive. Of course, as a game focused on the simulation of physics, it's no surprise to see this attention to detail in place. Then in 1999, Belgian developer Appeal released Outcast on the PC. It just happens to be one of my favorite PC games of the 90s, but it shipped with insane system requirements due to its software-driven voxel engine. And one of the defining features for the time is its water. Due to the software nature of the engine, the developers were able to pull off some interesting visual tricks, which simulate wave patterns and reflections of light and surroundings within the water surface. It's a simple but effective visual trick. But as the 90s drew to a close, big things were coming and water simulation would grow by leaps and bounds with each passing year. But let's start with fixed function platforms such as Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. There aren't a lot of Dreamcast games which pushed boundaries in this area, mind you. The arcade port of Hydro Thunder looks nice, but what else is there? Well, I believe one of the best examples of 90s style water rendering is found in Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future. The basic makeup here is simple. The water surface is still just a large flat plane with a nicely animated surface texture applied, but where the game really comes alive is below the ocean surface. The combination of depth fog, water caustics, and great texture work really helps bring the world of Echo to life. I did, however, notice that the presentation of water caustics only applies to specific objects and models. In this scene, for instance, Echo receives the effect while the two dolphins beside him do not. Still, the underwater world of Echo is remarkably evocative even today and well worth revisiting. Surf Rocket Racers from CRI is another decent example as well, with predefined wave patterns across its surface mesh, and a decent animated texture applied to that surface. Nothing amazing perhaps, but it still looks nice and it's neat to see the jet skis interacting with the water surface. Super Magnetic Neo is another fun example. While limited to just a few areas in the game, this title features pools of water with an interactive mesh which reacts to Neo's movements. Again, a small but nice touch. Swinging back around to the PlayStation 2, however, this is the platform where we started seeing major changes in terms of how water is rendered in games. Following the launch of the system, new titles started to appear showcasing impressive new methods for rendering water. Games such as Eco with its memorable windmill sequence, which ripples and changes when you jump in, or these little waterfalls in the original Dark Cloud stand out. So how do you pull something like this off? Well, I spoke to a developer that spent years working on the PlayStation 2 and they shared a couple different methods for generating water on this system. First, let's recall that the PlayStation 2 features two key components, the Emotion Engine and the Graphics Synthesizer. The Emotion Engine features a pair of vector processing units, VU0 and VU1, which are basically DSPs designed for fast 3D math, almost like a precursor to a vertex shader pipeline. Knowing this, developers could use the vector units to aid with water calculations. This technique is likely what you're seeing in games like Eco when you jump into the reflective pool of water. Basically, you could process water mesh ripple deformations and the like using one of the vector units, compute any reflection lookups, such as the surroundings near the windmill, and then send it all to the graphics synthesizer in one pass. Since everything is handled directly between the GS and vector units, the CPU bus is not bogged down by these operations. The PS2 can perform the necessary calculations very quickly because of this design. Water displacement then is handled by sending water contact with various bodies along with the vertex data to the vector unit, where you can then generate waves based on that information. Another more advanced solution can be observed in the game Splashdown from Rainbow Studios. Using the technology built for ATV Off-Road Fury, Rainbow tackled the water sports genre to great effect. Basically, the developers send the water surface rectangle itself to the vector units, which then process all necessary tessellation on the surface. With Splashdown, the water surface basically uses view-dependent adaptive tessellation, whereby the water mesh itself appears more complex when in close proximity to the camera. Over time, interactive water meshes would become increasingly common on the system. Even games like Neo Contra featured areas with simple interactive water meshes, but perhaps one of the best examples of this can be seen in Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. Ask anyone about impressive water throughout the history of games, and this is likely one of the first titles that people will bring up, and for good reason. Dark Alliance itself is a bit of a technical masterpiece here, featuring a smooth 60 frames per second frame rate, hugely complex geometry setup, and the best image quality on PlayStation 2. The lead programmer on the project was none other than Ezra Driesbach, who longtime DF Retro viewers might remember from Lobotomy Software, where he worked on Power Slave, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D for Sega Saturn. And thanks to the reliance on vector units and its fast triangle setup, the PS2 was well suited to adaptive geometry subdivision necessary to pull off smooth, rippling water surfaces. Other consoles from this era were slower in performing these calculations as they'd have to rely on the base CPU, though in reality, another important hardware feature, which we'll discuss shortly, would allow these consoles to push beyond the PS2. What makes Dark Alliance stand out here then is the quality of the water ripples used in the game. Every object can interact with every surface of water, with all actors producing appropriate ripples while moving through it. This can lead to some dramatic effects during a hectic battle, and the game simply never slows down. Even today, the fluidity of the water in Dark Alliance stands the test of time brilliantly. The game was also ported to Xbox and GameCube, where it looks similarly nice, but image quality and water quality isn't quite on par with the PS2 version. One other very different example of water on the PS2 that I'm fond of can be found in Time Crisis 2. When engaged in a battle during this river chase sequence, the water features an impressively detailed reflection, which warbles realistically as you move across its surface. It's another simple flat plane, of course, but the effect is convincing nonetheless. Another example that I'm fond of is the water in Klonoa 2. This is one of my favorite platform games in the system, and while the effect is fairly simplistic, I really like the look of their animated water texture combined with things like the waves in this very first stage. Seeing all of this play out at 60 frames per second back in 2001 was quite something to behold. This is also the console generation when water effects such as rain really started to take off. Metal Gear Solid 2 really led the charge on this with a natural looking effect that still holds up really well today. Konami utilized the extra fill rate of the PlayStation 2 to really push this effect up to 11, while also simulating things such as water reflections in the deck of the ship by simply drawing objects below the surface and using an appropriate texture on the top. At this point in time, the portrayal of water in games was improving by leaps and bounds. More and more developers were finding ways to simulate things like waves and interaction with water, while artists were taking advantage of new techniques to create beautiful new experiences. But things evolved quickly during this generation, when two new consoles arrived on the market more than 1 year after PlayStation 2. The arrival of GameCube, the Xbox, and more advanced PC accelerator hardware signaled new techniques, including the advent of programmable shaders, allowing artists to push new boundaries in terms of water rendering. But we'll have to wait until next week to explore these systems. That's right, in part 2 of the evolution of video game water, we'll explore classics such as Super Mario Sunshine with its beautiful ocean and sunny beaches, Wave Race Blue Storm, which pushes interactive water to the next level, Xbox games such as Morrowind, Halo, Bloodwake, and beyond, with their pixel-shaded water effects, Half-Life 2 on the PC, and so much more. So be sure to check back for that. For this episode, however, I think we've covered a lot of ground. During the early days of 8 and 16-bit titles, water was utilized more as a mechanic than as a visual nicety, which gave birth to the idea of water-themed levels, which persist to this day. Once 3D graphics entered the picture, however, attempts to simulate the fluidity of H2O started to appear, and while it doesn't look especially realistic now, neither did the surrounding graphics, so it worked. At the turn of the century, however, more realistic visuals meant that an increased focus on water was necessary if it were to match up to its more realistic surroundings. The extra processing power of new machines during this era greatly increased the quality of water rendering. With the introduction of Nintendo GameCube and Microsoft Xbox in the fall of 2001, new doors were suddenly opened to developers, and impressive visual effects were soon to follow. Xbox introduced the console world of programmable shaders, while the GameCube offered its own unique feature set. In fact, one might argue that the GameCube is Nintendo's best engineered console to date, with its PowerPC derived Gecko CPU, The ArtX develops Flipper graphics core with the rather flexible texture environment unit and other smart hardware features. The GameCube packs a lot of punch in a small purple package. And it was evident right at launch with titles such as Factor 5's Rogue Squadron 2 hitting new, unexpected heights in the display of real-time graphics. But while Rogue Squadron 2 focuses on its fine-grained simulation of the Star Wars aesthetic, the Redmond-based Nintendo software technology launched a proper sequel to Wave Race 64 alongside the system. While general opinions vary on this follow-up to Wave Race 64, I think most can agree that its handling of water is nothing short of a triumph. Wave Race Blue Storm follows up and expands upon the interactive water concept found in the N64 game. You're still racing around a course, slaloming between gates, while dealing with a beautiful wave simulation, but Blue Storm amps things up for the new console. The first thing you might notice is the addition of full scene reflections, an element lacking on Nintendo 64. As you race, the environment is reflected and distorted across the surface of the water. It looks fantastic and is correctly parallaxed with the surface, but how exactly is this achieved? Well, from what I can deduce, the reflections appear to take advantage of the embedded frame buffer trick, in which the current scene is used as input for the EFB, where it can then be manipulated and reintegrated into the main scene. This is the input image sent to the secondary frame buffer. This is then modified and sent back to the external frame buffer to be used in the main scene. As you can see, it's basically flipped with unnecessary geometry called from view, including the player model. The resulting image on real hardware seems to be quarter resolution and is used for the reflection. Since the player model is called from this main view, a second local reflection is generated directly below the player. There's more to it than that, but that's kind of the basic gist. So using Dolphin, we can enable a free camera option to decouple the viewport from the point defined by the game itself. When aligned properly, it displays the scene inverted to give the impression of real reflections, but if you change the positioning using the free camera option, these calculations are no longer valid since the game has no way of tracking the position of the free camera. Thus we get corruption like this. From what I understand, this idea of writing memory contents to an intermediate buffer and then manipulating the contents is kind of similar to what we see today with render targets. The basic idea involves storing the various buffers required for things such as a deferred renderer or complex surface effects, and then using them to create the desired result. You can render out to a texture, manipulate the texture using pixel shaders, then utilize the results in your main scene. Not unlike what we're seeing here in Wave Race. Then there's the wave simulation itself. With the increased polygon crunching power of the GameCube, NST can greatly increase the density of the water mesh while pushing its view distance out further from the player. In fact, if we zoom out here using an emulator, the water itself seems to encircle and follow the player character around the map, with increasingly complex subdivision occurring based on proximity to the player. At a distance, the mesh is suitably simplistic, but the water directly around the player model utilizes a higher density mesh. The developers have control over the ripple patterns across the entire surface, allowing for a wide range of stage types, including this stormy sea area. Racers all interact with the water surface as well, producing both polygonal water trails while exhibiting realistic buoyancy. Beyond this, the water surface itself features an animated surface texture to further increase the sense of realism. Dolphin can even reveal individual texture formats. We can see that the water surface here, for instance, uses the IA8 format, which is used for storing 8-bit intensity values alongside a separate alpha channel for transparency purposes. Taken together though, the result remains impressive to behold. The smooth waves and ripples vary greatly from track to track, and the simulation feels suitably realistic. It was a great way to show what the Nintendo GameCube could achieve right at launch. Less than a year later, however, Nintendo released the next mainline Mario adventure, Super Mario Sunshine. Unlike your typical Mario game, Sunshine focused on a singular island locale and its surrounding lands. It also features Flood, a back-mounted water cannon that Mario uses throughout the game. Now, if you ask anyone about the topic of water in video games, Mario Sunshine is typically one of the first games to be mentioned. Water plays a huge role in Mario Sunshine, and honestly, it still looks great today. The beautiful waves and sparkling water surface are gorgeous to behold, but how was it done? Well, the water, like many things in graphics rendering, is a combination of careful design and clever techniques. And one specific aspect of it has already been examined in great detail by a software engineer known as Jasper St-Pierre over on his blog Clean Rinse. If you want to mess with these interactive examples yourself, be sure to check out his blog, but I'll attempt to summarize here. We're basically starting by discussing the water surface itself, what creates that effect. Well, at its core, it's simply a trick using mipmaps in a creative way to help create the illusion of sparkling water. It starts with a pair of textures, which scroll at an even interval across one another, creating this effect. When blended with the background colors, it can appear blue, orange, or any other color the artist desire. It's kind of a simple effect on its own, and Nintendo itself has utilized this crisscrossing pattern back in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. See what I mean? But really, this is just the beginning of it. The next step relies on a creative use of mipmaps, and as a refresher, mipmaps are basically pre-computed textures used to reduce pixel reads on the GPU while reducing texture aliasing in a scene. The application then is based on distance from the camera, so smaller textures are used at a greater distance. These can of course be blended together smoothly using various texture filtering features, but you're ultimately looking at a series of increasingly small textures based on a single base texture. With Mario Sunshine though, Nintendo is basically assigning different textures to the various mipmap layers rather than using miniaturized versions of a base texture. So water textures near the camera have no pixels at all. It appears completely transparent. This is what prevents the water textures from colliding with the camera and also allows the player to see below the surface easily. Following that, we have a selection of different water textures of varying strength. Of note, the third mipmap layer is the brightest here, and it's used to give the impression of a band of light reflecting across the surface. It basically simulates sun reflecting off the water surface. The final step then involves a simple alpha test function, which produces results like this. It's a very clever solution, but it's only part of what makes the water so special. The next thing we have are the water refractions both above and below the surface, as well as full scene reflections in specific areas. This is another fascinating trick that involves using the embedded frame buffer to create cool effects. Looking first at the water refraction, from what I can tell at least, the scene is rendered out to the EFB and the resulting image receives a distortion effect that is then overlaid back into the scene. This is used to represent both the heatwave effect across the game and the water refraction when peering through the surface or from below it. It's also used to draw things like reflections in the stage. The entire scene is reflected in the water and parallax corrected to the camera frustum. Sunshine really goes nuts utilizing the EFB then. A flat plane resides just in front of the player for instance, and it's used to create heat waves and the darkening effect used across Isle Delfino during game progression. Then there's the water itself. If we dip below the waterline, you can still see the surface above Mario distorted by the ocean, right? Well, in reality, this surface appears to be completely opaque when viewed from this angle. The geometry on the other side is not called, however. Instead, it's used as a source for the EFB. What you're seeing is a separate image rendered out to that secondary buffer that is then sent back to the final frame with a distortion effect applied to give the impression of looking at refractions. All of these fancy tricks work together in tandem to simulate the reflection and refraction of light throughout the game, and it's really kind of cool, clever stuff, if a little overkill. Then there's the wave simulation. While not as robust as Wave Race, it still manages to look great. The water surface seems to use a function to produce a smooth wave pattern, causing the water to lap up smoothly on the shore. It doesn't even stop there. There's this goop that Mario cleans up during the game that appears reminiscent of what we would later see in the Splatoon series. There's Flood itself then, and the water spray, which even uses an EFB copy to display Mario's reflection in the puddles made by said water cannon. I don't know enough about the GameCube hardware to say for certain, but if I had to guess, it's all of these effects combined that force the team to stick with 30 frames per second rather than 60. After all, the preview footage of the game was shown at 60 FPS prior to all of the effects being fully implemented, and I'd imagine the cost of rendering out these scenes to the secondary buffer would have a significant impact on performance, but again, that's just my guess. Of course, Wave Race and Sunshine aren't the only GameCube titles to make waves. I already discussed the deformable water mesh in Metroid Prime back in that retrospective, and it still looks great here of course. I can see why the team opted to avoid creating optical refractions and reflections however, since it does seem to be expensive, and they wanted to hit 60 FPS. Again, just a guess though. Rare is certainly no slouch in this department either. Star Fox Adventures is perhaps one of the most technically impressive games available for the GameCube. With its large environments, smooth 60 frames per second frame rate, impressive lighting, and great use of fur and grass shading, it's really top tier material. Its water rendering is also suitably impressive. Basically, Star Fox utilizes the same render to texture feature that we saw in our initial two games covered today, though the overall effect does seem somewhat less ambitious overall. The scene is copied off to a secondary buffer, and then that is used as the basis for reflections here. As Fox wades through the water, there's also some nice ripple effects that trail behind him. Still, overall, the usage does seem somewhat simplified compared to Wave Race and Mario, with more noticeable edge artifacts visible throughout, but really, it still works. In revisiting the game though, I was most impressed with how Rare handles the grass. No doubt taking advantage of the texture environment unit, most of the grassy surfaces appear to have proper depth with an effect that simulates blades of grass, similar to Fox's fur. So while the actual rendering of water is merely good, the overall package is tremendously impressive, especially at 60 FPS in widescreen. There are other GameCube games with similar water effects as well of course, but one of the most unique representations of water can be found in The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. And this is an interesting case. You see, the game is heavily focused on a toon-like presentation that happens to take place in a flooded kingdom. So there's a need to render a lot of water here, but not necessarily in a realistic manner. At its base, the ocean surface consists of a repeating texture pattern. Tiling a single texture across a large surface plane, however, is a difficult thing to nail artistically, but Nintendo's artists did a great job here. The surface texture appears to use a subtle warping technique, which further reduces the sense of obvious tiling. The pattern and texture vary throughout, however. At some points, the water itself is nothing but an empty blue expanse, with some animated wave textures appearing at random. It also uses mipmaps to quickly fade to blue in some areas, which help reduce the effect of tiling. These elements are all fairly simple, but very effective in the context of this game. The next important piece stems from the movement of the water surface itself. Using what appears to be a series of sine curves, the ocean surface undulates and swells in a convincing manner. The roughness of the ocean also varies throughout the game according to position and weather. The simulated area is large as well. If we zoom out here using Dolphin, a large grid representing active ocean becomes visible. This plane moves around with Link, who seems to be the anchor for the entire simulation. It's gorgeous and effective. At this point though, I think it's fair to say that Nintendo's first and second party teams did a phenomenal job utilizing the hardware, and most of these examples still hold up brilliantly even today. But the Cube wasn't the only game in town. Microsoft Xbox launched around the same time. This beastly box with its NVIDIA GeForce 3 derived GPU introduced programmable shaders to the world of console development, allowing artists and engineers to create some cool new effects. A shader is basically a small program that can run on a GPU, which can manipulate a 3D scene in the rendering pipeline before it's drawn. Your input, such as a model or a texture, can be modified by the shader program to create a desired look. Vertex shaders can modify vertex position, color, texture coordinates, and other things, which can be very useful for three-dimensional water simulation, while pixel shaders can work with individual pixels, which is useful for manipulating things like textures, color, and the representation of lighting. You can do a lot of things with the shader language today, but as far as I can tell, things were more limited on the original Xbox. Even still, it's an important step in graphics rendering and was widely used across the platform. This hardware is precisely what makes things like per-pixel lighting and the water rendering possible in titles like Halo. While simple and non-interactive by today's standards, the basic water shader adds a layer of specularity to the surface that you really didn't see on PlayStation 2 or the Dreamcast. It basically helps with surfaces like water with a relatively low performance cost, at least as I understand it. Bloodwake is an early title for the Xbox which features a lot of water. It's basically a car combat game like Twisted Metal, but with boats, and at the time its rendering of water was extremely impressive. It's a basic mix of generated wave patterns combined with some nice shader work. The focus of its design is on the rendering of its surface, which exhibits a shininess designed to simulate light playing off its surface. It looks pretty good overall, though some proper reflections would have helped a lot, I think. Bloodwake also features different weather conditions, which vary the intensity of the wave simulation. Playing during a storm is a very different experience compared to the calm sea. Boats also influence the simulation, leaving trails behind which influence the handling of your boat as you pass over them. Again, a neat demonstration. Now, on the flip side, we have Blink's the Time Sweeper. This gorgeous platform game was often the butt of jokes back in the day, but that's not really fair. It's a great little game that almost feels like a lost Sega title. I love it. It also happens to feature some rather excellent interactive water effects, which are impacted by the time mechanic. Basically, pools of water use a neat vertex rippling technique that can collide with solid bodies such as Blinks himself. As you run through the water, it ripples and moves around the player in real time, similar to Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. But if you pause time, the water freezes in place and Blinks can carve right through it. When time starts again, everything falls back into place realistically with strong ripples. Vertex rippling is effective and was common even on PlayStation 2, but Blinks takes things a tad further by applying cubic environment maps to the surface. Cube maps are a great feature on the Xbox that received a lot of use, and they just happen to work really well in this instance when it comes to creating reflections. Of course, the sequel, Blinks 2, takes things even further. The water simulation and quality of the rendering is greatly improved. Reflection quality is increased as well, as is the detail of the water mesh. Another mainstay of the early Xbox era is The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. For many users, this is one of the first examples of a game using programmable shaders for water. It's available on the PC as well, of course, but we're looking at the Xbox version here. Compared to the rest of the environment, the water takes on a more realistic appearance, I think. Reflections are approximated, but the end result is still attractive most of the time, and it looked really impressive for 2002. When it rains, the water surface is changed to reflect this, with the appearance of a drop-like pattern which really amps up the atmosphere. In addition, a ripple shader is applied to the area around your character, giving the impression that you're interacting with the surface. Unfortunately, while it looked great for its time, there are several flaws evident today, especially on the Xbox. PC users can apply tweaks and mods to overhaul the game, but we're looking at it through the lens of 2002. The first issue is that reflections aren't updated regularly. When it does happen, it can look rather jarring like this. The reflection just sort of snaps into a new position. Beyond that, the surface animation is updated at a reduced rate compared to the main render, resulting in reduced overall fluidity. The water surface itself is also completely opaque, which becomes especially evident when trying to swim across it. Still, these were the early days of pixel shading, so it deserves a spot in history, and it's one of the things that sticks out about the game. Beyond Good and Evil is another example I'm fond of, though this doesn't necessarily use pixel shaders. While exploring the environment in your hoverboat, the world is covered in this gorgeous water effect. But what's interesting here is that the effect is retained across multiple platforms, including the PlayStation 2. My best guess here is that the reflections are derived from textures rendered out each frame, similar to Wave Race Blue Storm. As each console varies from one another, however, this implementation may vary as well. With Dolphin, we can confirm that the embedded frame buffer is utilized, but how is this achieved on PlayStation 2 and Xbox? It's difficult to guess, but the results speak for themselves. Another game from this era that renders out full scene reflections to a texture is the original Far Cry. Both the PC version and the Xbox pseudo-sequel that followed a year later. The PC version offers a large-scale open-world environment with dense foliage and huge draw distances. It was amazing for 2004, and we really hadn't seen anything like it before. Now, the water also looked pretty good at the time, but it isn't necessarily as convincing as other examples. The scene appears to be captured into another buffer, rendered to a texture and manipulated, then applied to the water surface. The ripples look great, but the issue here is that the amount of geometry rendered to the reflection buffer seems to be limited, so distant objects don't appear correctly, leading to what amounts to holes in the reflection. Of course, if you're familiar with Crytek's history, you know that they absolutely nail this aspect of rendering in their next game, Crysis. Curiously enough, the Xbox Far Cry game known as Instincts was developed by Ubisoft and offers a solution to water rendering that is in some ways superior to the original PC release. It does seem to use the same basic method for displaying reflections, but the developers also simulate the Fresnel effect. I'm not entirely sure how that's done though, but basically you'll notice how reflectivity increases based on distance from the camera. Areas near the player appear more transparent, while water in the distance appears more mirror-like. Speaking of this natural phenomenon, Half-Life 2 released in 2004, the same year as Far Cry, and offers a tremendous visual representation of water. Reflection, refraction, and the Fresnel effect are all simulated in a very believable fashion. Look closely at any scene featuring water in Half-Life 2 and you can see these three elements in action. From what I can tell, Half-Life 2 seems to use planar reflections. The basic gist involves creating a reflection matrix from the plane where a defined camera position can be used as a source input to render to a texture. Objects near the clipping plane can be properly culled from view to ensure that only the correct objects reflect. This data can then be sent to a shader and its position determined from there. The result is a reflection map. This basic concept is actually remarkably similar to what NST is doing with Wave Race Blue Storm. Objects below the water surface then exhibit proper refraction, that is, their appearance appears to be distorted by the water surface. This effect is displayed using a refraction map, which is captured in a similar way to the reflection map. Another notable feature stems from the physics simulation. Objects exhibit properties of buoyancy when dropped in water, and this varies based on material type. Objects such as plastic barrels or chunks of wood float realistically in the water, to the point where this is sometimes used to solve certain puzzles like this. Of course, the surface plane itself is entirely flat and non-interactive, but the visual representation of water and the application of physics is second to none for 2004. It's still a beautiful looking game. Now, 1 year after the release of Half-Life 2, the PC received another gem in the form of Monolith's Fear. Now, Fear itself is focused on lighting, shadows, first-person gunplay, and the like, but it also features an occasional pool of beautifully rendered water. In this case, the developer appears to be using planar reflections combined with a deformable water mesh that can react to the player's movement and gunfire. It's a convincing and beautifully rendered effect. Fear also features water caustics, but it's worth noting that it's not really a proper simulation. Ripples made in the water are not reflected in the caustics. It's still rather effective though, and for a game not focused on such effects, it looks really nice. From this point then, the next generation of consoles started to make an appearance, and suddenly water rendering began to improve by leaps and bounds. There's no way I could address everything here in the scope of this video, however, so instead I opted to pick out a few examples that were requested by the community, starting with Bioshock. Set in the underwater city of Rapture, water plays a key role in the presentation. In this case, Bioshock doesn't really push new boundaries in terms of technology, but this artist-driven approach to water rendering works brilliantly in realizing the intended atmosphere. There are many ways in which water is used throughout the game. During the introduction sequence, for instance, the player is dropped right into the ocean at night. The fire and wreckage of the drowned plane are beautifully reflected across the surface. It's a remarkably evocative moment, and it's a great way to start the game. Then, moments later, the player steps into a bathysphere, descending into the underwater hell that is Rapture. The water laps up over the window as the descent begins, and following a stirring speech by Andrew Ryan, the player is introduced to the city itself. Here, the developers seem to use a subtle mix of rippling of the view and lots of transparent particles used to represent air bubbles, a technique you'll see later when peering through the windows from within Rapture. Once in the city, water is visible everywhere. It pools in shallow puddles on the floor, drips from the ceilings, and fills entire rooms. It's a perfect blend of excellent art direction and attention to detail. In some scenes, water caustics are visible as light plays off the water surface, and it looks great. In another early area, a piece of plane crashes through a tunnel, unleashing a flood on the player. Using a mix of 2D billboards, geometry, and water textures, you really get a sense that the tunnel is violently filling up behind you. Gorgeous water refractions are evident as well in some areas, like this, where the tiles situated below the water surface are properly distorted. Even small puddles exhibit a similar quality. In select scenes, the game even seems to make use of planar reflections to set the mood. This particular moment looks fantastic. Now, all of this footage here is captured from the original Xbox 360 version, as this is how I first experienced the game, but it's gorgeous on any machine, and in fact the water effects are slightly enhanced if you play the DX10 version on PC. So while it's true that there's no geometric distortion or actual volume to the water here, the quality of the artwork shines through, and Bioshock remains a great example of water and gaming. Halo 3 is another game that deserves a mention here, with a very different approach to water. While Bioshock focuses on recreating the effect of light playing off the surface of water, Halo 3 goes for a more robust simulation. The fluid system is primarily focused on interaction and depth. Water in Halo 3 is primarily presented as a plane with generated wave and ripple patterns. For a game with such large bodies of water, it's rather convincing, especially in these larger maps. Now, in some stages, such as the first mission, the water appears calm, with gentle ripples flowing across its surface. Water dripping from the ceiling of a cave structure creates concentric circles in the water below. In a later mission, however, players encounter a much larger body of water with real-time geometric ripples, which also react to player movement and weapons fire, not to mention the Warthog. So while the reflection and refraction of light is limited in this particular instance, the appearance of choppy water is remarkably convincing. It really feels like a proper body of liquid rather than a simple flat plane. In other areas, however, water refraction and Fresnel are accounted for. The terrain below the water surface ripples accordingly, with the water surface becoming increasingly mirror-like at a distance. It's a shame then that some of the later games in the series, including the otherwise advanced Halo 4 and 5, feel like a step back compared to Bungie's Halo 3 in this regard. It's all very impressive work from Bungie. One last game I wanted to briefly cover then is Hydrophobia Prophecy. There's not a lot of information out there on how this works, but basically it was originally released for Xbox 360 as Hydrophobia, then later ported to the PS3 and the PC. It's a survival horror game, and it's developed by the company Blade Interactive, using their internal Hydro engine. The basic gist here is that it's completely dynamic. Fluid dynamics are simulated using a combination of geometry and surface effects, but what sets it apart is the way in which it behaves. The water mimics the behavior of real liquid. It can fill a room or be drained based on what's happening around the player. This allows the developer to play around with rising and falling water levels to create harrowing sequences. Open a door and water will realistically spill out. A break in the hall can have the opposite effect then, with previous open hallways filling with water as you make your way through the stage. Beyond the simulation, Hydrophobia also presents beautiful reflection and refraction effects. It has an appearance reminiscent of Bioshock, but is far more dynamic and systems driven. I can't say that the game itself is a resounding success necessarily, but I was really impressed by the ambition of this project. It's been 8 years since the game was originally released, and we're still not seeing games attempt this type of simulation. So while it has its own limitations, the results are still rather impressive. At this point then, I feel that we've covered a lot of ground, yet there's still so much more that we couldn't touch on. From the gorgeous water in the original Crysis, to the beautiful simulation of the ocean in Uncharted 3, water has continued to evolve and improve with time. And if I had more time, I would have loved to cover even more games. Of course, things certainly aren't perfect today. Fluid simulation remains a challenge, and the increased complexity of modern rendering requires an approach to reflections that sometimes falls a little short. Many viewers have expressed complaints over screen space reflections, for instance, but it's still a good, relatively fast solution to this problem. Planar reflections, for instance, are simply too computationally expensive these days. Still, technology continues to improve, and perhaps someday real fluid simulation will become viable in games. That's all for now though. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thanks for sticking with me. It's certainly been an interesting project, and there's still a lot more to learn. If you enjoyed this episode though, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing the bell for notifications, and following us over on Twitter. But until next time, stay retro.